So now that you have your development environment set up, let's go ahead and take a look at what a Windows Phone 8 project really looks like when we're working in Visual Studio. So you can go ahead and open up Visual Studio, and as you can see here, I've already created a basic application. And if you've never done it before, you're simply going to go to File, New Project. You're going to select the Templates, Visual C#, Store Apps Templates, and select Windows Phone Apps. And in this case, I've merely selected a blank app, and then I hit OK. So that gave us this basic project structure here that you're going to become very familiar with as we go along. So as you can see here, we now have the basic folders that you would typically see within a normal .NET C# project, where we have our properties and our assembly info.cs file, as well as our references file. Now the first difference you're going to notice when you're creating a Windows Phone 8 application is that the references look a little different. So if you're used to seeing things like system or system.io or things like that, you're not going to see those. And the reason for that is because when we're working with Windows Phone applications, we're using a subset of the .NET framework, and that's being represented here by these two references, .NET for Windows Store Apps and Windows Phone 8.1. So those are subsets of the actual .NET framework that you typically use when you're writing maybe desktop applications or ASP style applications, and that is okay, but it's something that you're going to have to keep in mind when you're thinking about using third-party libraries or anything like that that you might normally use in your applications. You're going to have to make sure that they're compatible with Windows Phone 8.1 and its subset of the .NET framework, so just something to keep in mind. Then we also have an assets folder, which is typically going to contain all of our logos and images and splash screens and any other type of really images that you want to work with. And as you can see here, it's kind of adopted the naming convention to specify the scale at which these images are created and stored at, and in this case we see that we are specifying 240. Now you can have different resolutions for different phones and their form factors, so it's something to keep in mind that you could possibly have to create different assets at different resolutions and different sizes based on the different form factors and resolutions that you're working with. Now you can typically get away with sticking with one size for each application, as right now the form factors of the phones don't change very much. The resolutions change a little bit, but not too much, so you're probably safe for a while, but it's definitely a good habit to get into if you want to start targeting larger devices and making universal apps. Then you might want to consider creating multiple sized assets and following some sort of convention to name them either within subfolders or using a naming convention as you see here. Then we also have the app.xaml file. Now this is a basic XAML file, and if you've never used XAML before, or if you're unfamiliar with it, that's not a big deal. We're going to go over the basics of XAML and what it is and how to work with it, but it's very easy to think of XAML as just a declarative way to use a XML style syntax to actually create and instantiate classes and properties just as you would in a normal C# applications. And we'll go through that in a little bit more detail in an upcoming lesson. Then underneath this, if you were to expand app.xaml, you're going to see app.xaml.cs. Now this is what's known as a code behind file that actually runs in the background behind your XAML file. And really this is just typical C# code. You have your classes, you have some properties, you have a constructor, some overridden methods, and a lot of other things going on behind the scenes, which we'll also get into. So the app.xaml and app.xaml.cs file are basically considered your starting points. That's where your application is going to start up and where it gets a bit of its identity in where to start when actually starting your application, what is the first page in your application, and things like that. So in our case, we only have one page, which also happens to be the main page. And if we were to double click on this, you'll see it load up in the designer here. So we have two options when we're working with our XAML pages. And in this case, we have both of them in a split screen style. We have this designer on the left, and we have the actual XAML that represents this page on the right. And you'll notice that when we start to edit one, it's going to, in real time, update the other. And just for an example, if I were to come into my toolbox and I were to say grab a button, and then drag it onto the design surface, you'll see here that not only did I drop a button onto the designer, but I also got this example of a button element within my XAML here on the right. And you're going to notice that when you change something on one, it'll update on the other. So if I were to come in here and maybe change this margin here to 200, you see that the button moved on the screen to give that left margin of 200. So you can see there's a very good tie-in between these two panes. Now, we're probably going to spend a little bit more time working on the XAML side of the world, but I wanted to show you the designer too, as you can do a lot of drag and drop and come in here to your toolbox and drag all sorts of different controls on here. And it's a very nice designer to use for that purpose. Now, what you can do also is on the little tool pane here in the middle, you have a few options. You can have left and right, you can have top and bottom. You can also make different panes disappear with these arrows, so I can collapse this pane and only work with this one. I can expand it, and I can also use these arrows to flip-flop them and then ultimately collapse the right and then just work with the XAML. So I think it's very important for you to see both ways to create these applications and these UIs, to be able to drag and drop things on the designer, but also to actually manually work with the XAML, because that's a very good skill to have, especially if you're doing other types of applications that use XAML, say WPF applications or maybe Silverlight applications. And even in a lot of the new Xamarin tool sets like Xamarin Forms, you can also be using a lot of XAML. So it's definitely something to get used to using if you've never used it before. Behind that main page.xaml, we also have the CS file, the code behind file here as well. So you can do a lot of the same overrides and things of that nature that you saw within the app.xaml and the app.xaml CS files. And then finally, we have the package.appx manifest. And this is a typical manifest. If you're used to doing any sort of mobile development on any other platforms, you're probably going to see a file that's going to be very similar to this. So in here you have a number of tabs along the top, and you can see a number of properties about the overarching application. So you see the display name, its entry point, which is the app9.app class. We have a default language and a description. What supported rotations are we going to use? Are we going to enable certain types of notifications? And what are we going to do with the tiles? That's another thing that we're going to talk about in integrating with the platform itself, is you have the concept of tiles when you're working with Windows Phone. And then you have different visual assets, and as you can see in here, there's a number of the assets that were defined within our assets folder are being assigned to certain things in here. So we have a 360 by 360 asset here, and it's been assigned to this particular image. And you can go through and do the same thing with all these different styles or different logos or images based within your application. You can also set a badge or a splash screen and things of that nature. Then we also have some requirements of what we're going to be able to access, like the gyroscope or different cameras. And along those same lines, you're also going to see things like capabilities, where we're going to enable this application to have access to certain things within the phone, say the internet or location or a microphone, or maybe one of the libraries that the user has for images or music on their phones. And then we have some other things about declarations, about different types of tasks or pickers or things that we're going to be using. We also have the content URIs here, so we can actually add different content here from URLs that are specified out on the internet. And then finally, how this particular application is going to be packaged. It has a unique identifier here for the package name, and then it has a nice display name, and then some versioning information here as well. So that's the basic layout of a typical Windows Phone app once you create it out of the box. And when we start to actually work with this, we're going to pick these pieces apart. We're going to go into much more detail on the actual XAML pages themselves and how to use them and what it's like to work with the XAML. And then we'll start to talk about some of the different components you can put onto the XAML, onto these UI pieces, as well as some of the accepted patterns to use when doing Windows Phone development. So we've got a lot of things to cover throughout this course, but I promise you it's not going to be that bad. We're going to take it one step at a time. So let's go ahead and see what's next on the agenda.